We're live.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the second live event for our Unit 1 of Connected Courses. I'm Mimi Ito at the Digital Media and Learning Research Hub, and I'm really delighted to be hosting a special conversation with Richard Arum and Josipa Roxa about their new book, Aspiring Adults Adrift, as well as their earlier book on Academically Adrift. And many of you may already be aware of this work because it's generated quite a lot of buzz in the higher education community because of the massive scale of research that both of these scholars have done around higher education and looking very thoughtfully, critically, and constructively at how our goals and practices and institutional policies within higher education have been shifting over the years, and what kinds of effects that's been having on student outcomes that all of us who have been part of connected learning and part of connected courses, I think really care about. So I think it's a very important research perspective on many of the core questions that have been at the center of this kickoff unit for connected courses, which is really intended for us to delve deeply into not only the why of why we teach and care about teaching and our students, the why of our courses, but also the why and purpose of higher education and education more broadly. So I can't think of a better set of research perspectives to bring into this conversation early in the course. So both Josipa and Richard are professors of sociology and education, and as I mentioned, have been doing a ton of work, empirical research around higher education. But I think importantly, both Richard and Josipa are not just observers and critical commentators about some of the trends in higher education, but are actively involved in trying to make a difference in the everyday practices and institutional policies of these learning institutions that we care so much about. Josipa is involved in her institution in advising the provost and also developing new kinds of institutional practices and policies at the Center for Advanced Study of Teaching and Learning in Higher Education. Richard, I've had the great good fortune of collaborating with Richard on the Connected Learning Research Network and related research associated with the MacArthur, and his team have been conducting studies for many years now in partnership with a lot of our youth serving programs and schools. This has really been research that's been foundational to the continuous improvement of the programs that we've been involved in. Richard is also a senior fellow right now at the Gates Foundation, so also trying to make a difference in that context as well. So really delighted to have both of you joining us today. And I thought just for folks who may not have had a chance to delve into your new book, as I did this week, I was wondering if you could start by describing a little bit about your, the broader arc of your research and some of your motivations around the two books that you've written together in the past few years.
That's great, Mimi, and I'll start off, and then Joseph and I tend to go back and forth, and also let me just at the beginning here, how excited we are to join you in this community, because both of us really believe that the community you're in dialogue with around this work are really kind of at the leading edge of attempting to innovate and find solutions for some of the problems that we're facing in education more broadly, but higher education specifically. To answer, Mimi, your question about motivations for the work, an existing ongoing effort that was being organized by the Council for Aid to Education, where they were working with several dozen colleges and universities to assess students when they started college, at the end of 2 years, and at the end of 4 years. And Josip and I heard about this existing effort, and we quickly realized there was an opportunity to do basic social science research around the end of the day being able to say college A is better than college B, but surveying students about what they were actually doing, collecting their transcripts, and actually trying to understand better what were the determinants of learning in college. And as we started that process, we also were interested in part because of the difficult economic circumstances that existed, and in part simply because of the opportunity that presented itself to continue following these students after they graduated 2 years into their transitions after college. And by transitions, we were interested in labor market transitions, but also as sociologists, interested in a broader range of outcomes that we think colleges and universities have an important role in shaping and structuring.
Thanks, Richard. That's super helpful. Jospa, did you want to jump in on this question?
I guess I can also just say that it's interesting if you look at K-12 research, where we do have a lot of information about students' trajectories through through kind of K-12 system. They're often given tests in English and math, science. We have their grades, and we can really kind of think about who is learning different skills and how and why, with the caveat of tests having issues like all tests do. But if you think about higher education, we knew nothing about whether students are learning in higher education. We knew if they got in and if they finished. Our only metrics of success in higher ed are students get a degree or not. And so part of the thinking here also is, how do we have a more nuanced understanding of what happens in higher education, and can we have better ideas about what students actually learn, not just whether they get a degree at the end of the day.
Yeah, that's such an important point. And as somebody who's doing research more in the K-12 sector, I thought that was really eye-opening that you pointed that out in the book. So I also wanted to just encourage people to, if you have questions, I'll be trying my best to monitor the Twitter feed around #CCourses. If you want to ask questions there, I'll do my best to introduce them into this conversation. So again, just as another setup question for people who may not be fully familiar with your work, I was hoping you could highlight what you think are the key findings that have come out of your studies, particularly for college faculty who are really hoping to make a difference and really care about the progressive outcomes that I think are a shared value set between us.
Yeah, so I can start again there. From the first book, Academically Adrift, the key findings that really kind of jumped out at us, and I think our readers as well, is what students themselves told us about their academic experiences in four-year colleges in this country. And that is that we're spending very little time on their studies, and we're facing very limited demands. And so, some of the key findings we've repeatedly pointed to in terms of hours studying. 36% of the students reported that they studied alone less than 5 hours a week. That is less than an hour a day. And in terms of hours studying, the amount of hours studying had dropped in half in the past few decades from earlier time use data. Students also said they had very limited reading and writing requirements in their courses. 50% of the students said they didn't have a single class that asked them to write 20 pages over the course of the semester. Roughly a third said they didn't have a single class that asked them to read more than 40 pages per week. And so with this very limited academic press, a very limited academic investment, not surprisingly, when they were given a test of their general skills, critical thinking, complex reasoning, and writing, this performance task that the Council for Aid to Education developed, large numbers of them didn't move up very much on that indicator. In this follow-up study, when we look at people 2 years out of graduation, we found, again, a very difficult economic period they were transitioning into, and large numbers of them were indeed struggling. And you, at the top of the web, you pointed out some of these, close to 3/4 were still receiving financial assistance from their parents 2 years after graduating. Roughly 1/4 of them were back living at home with their parents 2 years after graduating. If you looked at just at those people in the labor market that is not back in grad school, less than half had full-time jobs where they were being paid $30,000 a year or more. So again, very difficult transitions, and also difficult transitions in other parts of their life, including civic engagement. And you know, that's really the picture we saw across the board. And Josip and I argued that colleges and universities could do a lot better job meeting the needs of these students and being much more intentional about their curriculum design and their programs to try and support these transitions, graduate transitions, better.
So a more optimistic read that one may think about is, if I had to do a one-liner, I would say academic rigor pays off in terms of faculty, message to the faculty. I think there's oftentimes this sense that, you know, if I'm rigorous in my courses, students may not like it, they may not enroll, my enrollments go down, they may not be that happy on the evaluations, whatever. But, you know, the good news, the bad news is what Richard said, which is that average outcomes are pretty low, are oftentimes not engaged. The good side is that when they are engaged, when they're asked to read, when they're asked to write, when they're asked to think, they actually improve those skills like critical thinking, complex reasoning, and writing, and those skills do track with labor market success afterwards. And so, you know, it might be hard, it might be challenging, it might be in contrast to many incentives currently in place in higher ed, but at the end of the day, academic rigor does pay off.
That's a really great point. So really to challenge students is an important goal and design principle for our work. I'm just going to insert a question that came from Aaron on Twitter, just a clarifying question about how did you define studying? Is it doing course readings, research, or something different, all of the above?
Yeah. So we have the survey instrument at the back of both of the books. The question is very broad. How many hours do you spend studying and preparing for your classes? It's not verbatim, but it's pretty close. We asked separately for studying alone and studying with peers. And we found in our work that the studying with peers wasn't associated with gains on the CLA over time. And the way we understand that, because like you, Mimi, we're very interested in having students engaged with larger communities of adults as well as peers around their interest. The way we understood it was that it was really important to have those interactions structured. And so that students just sent off to study in groups really didn't have the skills and competencies and training to really make productive use of that time. And again, that's not a finding we were expecting going in, but it jumped out at us in from the pattern of results we saw in the data.
Interesting. Yeah, those numbers of like 1 hour a week during the week of studying. It's a pretty stunning number. I think that caught people's attention for sure. Another clarifying question on the study, did you look at community colleges or just four-year colleges? This is from Amanda on Twitter.
Yeah, just 4 years institutions. We joined an existing project, as Richard mentioned at the beginning, and only 4-year schools were included in that. Of course, expanding this to look at 2 years would be very valuable and important.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to jump off the point that Josipa raised about just challenge and rigor as being very important, and not for faculty not to back off from really challenging their students. One of the discussions that we've been having in connected courses is how do you design a course that's really driven by a sense of purpose, a purpose-driven course, rather than one driven by, say, content or accountability or other kinds of drivers for that challenge and rigor. I think one of the broader sort of findings that I'm getting from your book, and the titles of your book really, both books really signal this, is that kids are lacking in purpose, the sense that they're adrift, that they don't have clearly defined goals, they're not sure where they're going. And some of the case studies you have of learners who are really thriving, both during college and after school, are young people who are not only doing academically rigorous work and applying themselves to challenges, but who have clearly defined goals and sense of purpose in their life. Do you have any suggestions for, it's not just challenging students, but challenging them in ways that cultivate this sense of purpose?
Yeah, so I think in both those books we argued that what was really one of the things that was necessary was that colleges and universities and educators within them confront students with a counter-narrative about what the purpose is of college, and really connects them to the academic work that they're being asked to undertake. I think too often today it is very unclear to students what the actual purpose is of the courses that they're undertaking. And so think about general education requirements as an example. Those courses, I think many of us believe, should be at the heart of developing the skills and competencies students need to master for the future, and including thinking broadly about their role in society and civic engagement and the like. But I think if you ask a typical student, they have little to no understanding of what those courses are being, what the original intent of those courses was. And so I do very much like the language that your group is adopting about moving to kind of a purpose-based design around instruction, and whether those are still within the framework of a course, or maybe we start thinking about project-based, competency-based approaches and so on. I think it's still to be determined. And one of the interesting things to me, just looking at the landscape today, is how technology likely will play a role in kind of that redefinition and restructuring of how students experience higher education. And I think it could do it. I think there's a potential there for it to do it in a very positive way. There are risks there also, of course, but I think there's lots of possibility there.
Yeah, no, we're definitely, this crew in Connected Courses is experimenting with that, just because the online world can give that sense of real-world connection and relevance if we do it right. Obviously, the technology can go either way on that. I'm also wondering if it just connects to, the earlier points you both were making about just anticipating that transition to the workplace in a more intentional way, not necessarily by being strictly vocational, but by offering those relationships and scaffolds that make the content of the course relevant to that broader life arc. I mean, I think that we have a rare window into this with your work because you follow these kids over such a long time.
Yeah, I think there are two dimensions there. I mean, one is we do find that students who did like internships and apprenticeships and had that connection to the labor market, they had much smoother transitions. And so there's something to be said for building the connections between the academic and the kind of world beyond the academic for the students. But even more, perhaps, is that making the case for the kind of critical thinking, complex reasoning, and writing. And so we find that employers, if they're asked kind of what they want college graduates to know and what's important that college graduates bring to the labor market, they will say, critical thinking, analysis, writing. We find in our work that those skills are related to how well students do afterwards. But I think in higher education, we rarely make that explicit. We think we teach critical thinking, but that's never. It's never clear what it is. Students really don't know that's what they're doing, and we never connect it to the fact that that's what employers want, and it's actually a very important skill to have to be successful in labor market, but also just be a good citizen and an engaged member of a society. And so I think part of it is having more intentional connections to the labor market, but part of it is just offering the rationale for what we do, why we do, and why that matters.
Yeah, that's such an important point. So it's changing that conversation or being clearer about the kinds of outcomes and dispositions that we're looking for, that we want young people to be able to solve problems, make things, think in complex ways and systemic ways. And, that's a very different kind of accountability and outcome structure than a lot of, I think, what we assume. I mean, certainly in K-12, but even in higher education. I think that's one of the provocations that Mike Wesch made to this group early on, is his own shift in instruction from a content-based to that more underlying, deeper, purpose-driven, and deeper learning kind of orientation, rather than needing to push the skills and content of his discipline on his students. So that seems very in line with some of the thinking that our group has been doing. I wanted to pull, there's some really interesting questions coming over Twitter. Here's one that I'm really curious about, is just given the administrative push for retention and success, a lot of faculty are fearful of increasing rigor with their students. This is from Jim. Do you have any suggestions about how to deal with that level of pressure that faculty are experiencing?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a real challenge today. All the incentives in the system are to race, to engage in a race to the bottom of lowering academic standards and not challenging students in an appropriate way. And I think it goes back to kind of this earlier conversation we were having around students' interest. And so there's a way to take students' interest and interests that are aligned with adult transitions in the future, and nourish them and cultivate them and develop them and channel them in appropriate, useful ways. And I think what's too often happens in colleges and universities today is less attention and focus on those interests that students come into the institutions and manifest, and much greater attention to, in a cynical way, to their needs and interests that they're expressing as 17-year-olds, as consumers. And so you see colleges and universities systematically disinvesting in academic programs, full-time faculty in steep decline in most institutions of higher ed, and social amenities growing dramatically, again, in most four-year institutions, where you see new dormitories being built, new student centers being built, new gyms being built, and these are very visible to 17-year-olds picking between colleges. But again, and students have an interest in them, but again, they also have interest in these other things, and those are the ones colleges and universities, educators have a responsibility to identify the positive interests that are aligned with adult success, and again, nourishing and cultivating and helping students develop them.
Yeah, yeah, that's super helpful, and that really goes back to, I think, what Josipa was saying about that drumbeat that we just have to keep on, which is that the things that actually matter are the critical thinking, analysis, and literacy skills. I mean, you really demonstrated that that's what makes kids successful in life. So I think if we can continue on that drumbeat, then, hopefully the administration will also realize that that's a set of outcomes that people should really be caring about. I also really appreciate your kind of tying in the connected learning and interest-driven learning angle to this, and the shout out that you had in your book to connected learning too, because one of the things that I think could be interpretation of your results is that you crack down on the social, right? And I think it's really important to stress that, yes, the book clearly demonstrates that there's been this huge swing away from academic to social and recreational activities on campus. I mean, that's a clear finding, very significant. But I don't think the answer then from that, to say, oh, they're not learning when they're socializing around their studies and all of that, is to say that social learning is bad. I think it's the point you're making, Richard, is quite subtle and very important to connected learning, is that when the social is aligned with interests and learning and problem solving and civic engagement, then social activity is a huge accelerator of learning. And so the problem we have on campuses is that the social is actually defined, as our culture defines it, too often as something in opposition to learning rather than something in supportive of, and the curriculum is not designed for young people to be able to connect with each other around things that matter deeply to them and that they want to pursue in life. And that's where you get this, oh, the social is in opposition to academics, where we know from high-functioning connected learning environments that it can really operate as a huge driver. So that was a long-winded way of diving into another question, which is, do you have examples or suggestions of practices that you see in institutions that are really, meeting young people where they are in their interests and the things they care about, but also tying it into academics and critical thinking and civic engagement and the things that we're all trying to promote as educators?
So I think a number of institutions are starting to experiment with a range of different possibilities. I think part of it is that those are usually small and not very well known and not shared more broadly. But I know, for example, at the University of Virginia, we have community classes that are tied to community endeavors. So students actually have a project in a community that they work on, and they also have a class that they meet at the same time, and they have kind of an exchange between the academic learning, what they're doing in the community, what they're learning there. They're bringing that to the classroom, and it goes back and forth. And we have launched that a few years ago, and it's been amazing success. Students really enjoy it. Students feel like all that book sense is actually making sense. They feel like they're understanding what's happening in community. Oftentimes, it's working with a nonprofit or working with schools, and they're reading about schools and teachers and students in a classroom, and then they actually go to a real classroom and they realize what the tensions and differences and challenges are and how to actually, think about it both ways. And so, I think there's kind of a growth of, classes of that sort. They are very labor intensive, and they need to be small, and you have to have the community partners and things like that. But I think those kinds of possibilities certainly create opportunities to not have that. Yes, social is usually thought of as a party time, but that's, I think, a wrong way to think about it. But there's all this extracurricular and outside of the classroom experiences that students engage with that you can link to what happens in the classroom as well, and that can be very productive for students, both as they go to the world beyond, but also as they think about everything they're reading and making sense of the academic world.
Yeah, and I just jump in to add there that one of the ways that one potential solution to this problem, that it's very labor intensive, and to to structure these courses is, of course, the role of technology. That there's ways to technology does is really good at bringing people together in very cost-effective ways and connecting them to people that share their interest in the larger community and so on. And so it's some of the use of technology in that way. I think is again potentially very interesting and promising.
Yeah, those are great examples, and I was also reminded of the example that Mike West shared in an earlier event of what he did with his course is have his kids live in a assisted living facility with some folks for a while, and engage in the community and really get kids out in the world. But yes, it is tremendously labor intensive, and something that is maybe outside the comfort zone of a lot of faculty, but it's really inspiring to see when it works like that. I have some more questions from the tweet stream. So I think there's an important one about the issue of rigor in relation to students with diverse skills and abilities, especially in technical subjects. I think the issue of equity and differences in college preparation is also incredibly important. Do either of you have a comment on that in relation, I think this was in relation to our earlier conversation about making sure the curriculum stays rigorous and challenging. Could that have a downside of excluding kids who may not be quite as prepared for that?
I think it depends what you mean by rigorous. I mean, if that means having a class in which you fail half of the class because it's a weed-out course for biology, then yes, you can make that extremely rigorous and demanding, and basically eliminate half of the potential majors. The other way to think about rigor is to think about how do you get students engaged in learning, and how much can they improve their skills, whatever they bring in, right? It actually to improve that, to learn, to develop, and to be at the point where they can progress to the next level. And
Maybe did we lose Josipa there?
It looks like we're having a little bit of I
was going to jump in, but I'll give her.
We lost a little bit of what you said just now because of bandwidth issues. Maybe the last two sentences.
Oh, okay, sorry. I think the last two sentences were that there is, if you think about rigor as learning, right? If you think about how much students learn, to take students where they are and to make sure they're progressing to the next level, then rigor can be kind of thought in a very different way. It's not about being so demanding and just making sure students fail. It's about being demanding but providing the tools for students to actually succeed. And there's a big difference between just failure and supporting students to succeed.
Another way to talk about it is kind of think about the logic of how we modeled learning in our work. We used a value-added framework that looks at kind of not kind of a final level of proficiency, a yardstick of where you expect all students to get to and jump over, but rather that colleges and universities, no matter where people start from, should be able to move them ahead, should be able to demonstrate gains. And so it's that framework that I think is the most appropriate framework to be using in thinking about kind of academic rigor. Again, not a line in the sand. If you don't make it over here, you're going to have to repeat this course indefinitely. And the course isn't for credit, by the way. And I'm giving the example of many developmentalists that have really been a major barrier to many low-income students in this country. But again, that you need to show growth. You need to show that you've moved ahead for the time and energy invested in your academics.
Yeah, I think that's such an important nuance, that it's really about engagement and growth rather than weeding and accountability, because I think with terms like rigor and challenge, they could get interpreted to mean just giving lots of D's and F's, and that's definitely, I don't think, the message that's coming through from your work. So that's very helpful clarification. And I think also needs to be messaged at the administrative level too, in important ways. I have another message from Erin, who sounds like she's an academic librarian, and she's curious, as an academic librarian, how can we market the skills teaching we do to faculty in order to assist with critical thinking, etc.? Any suggestions?
You know, I mean, Rich, we talked earlier about having to re-envision and have a new way of thinking about students and what they need to do in college and what college is about. There's a similar kind of re-envisioning of faculty, I would say, in many ways. Currently, you know, faculty in the PhD programs are trained to be researchers. There's not much emphasis on teaching, and they're not trained how to teach. They don't know all the research about how students learn and when they learn better and how do we structure classrooms and, you know, what does group work really mean? It doesn't mean just telling students to go away and do something and come up with a paper. It means actually structuring that activity. And so faculty to get rid of content, right, and just focus on what can we cover and how much can we cover, and think really about, you know, what do I want this course to accomplish? And I think once we shift the lens to that, once we kind of get the faculty to think that what they want to do and what they need to do and think about is developing critical thinking, composition, and writing. And I think most of the faculty would say that's what they do, but it's not very explicit, it's not very intentional, and they're not oftentimes trained to do that. And so, you know, I'd say that the same kind of re-envisioning that we have for students, we have a re-envisioning for faculty that needs to take place.
Yeah, and so I just jump on there. I totally agree with you, Josepha. I add on that, you know, what I see is many faculty are really hungry to think about how better to meet the needs of today's students. Part of that is technology, right? And so. Mimi, before when you invited us on, you were saying how much interest you've gotten in this series you're doing, the course you're doing here, and I'm not surprised. There are lots of faculty really want to know kind of how to use these tools to better reach students. They weren't trained typically in those skills. You know, the other piece I would say is in Aspiring Adults Adrift, in the conclusion, we spent a lot of pages, many of our readers probably say too many pages, talking about assessment. And faculty often don't want to hear about assessment, but in part because often assessment has been used in the past around accreditation. And colleges and universities have gone through these compliance exercises where they demonstrate through assessment some learning outcomes have been achieved, but it's really not a serious effort that is going to inform improvement of instruction and curricular design. And so what we really think is essential, and back to the question of the librarian, what I think faculty will increasingly have an interest in figuring out is how to use assessment to improve their teaching and curricular design and their experiments with technology to see what works and what doesn't work. And that's the only way we're going to be able to engage in an iterative design process to improve these kind of exciting, innovative tools that are now being developed and better meet the needs of the students in the future.
Yeah, that's a great point, and I think it ties into the potential, you know, the role of technology as kind of a Trojan horse for new innovative practices if we do it right. And I think the faculty assembled for Connected Courses are really a great example of those faculty who are eagerly engaging with the new tools in a way that we're trying to create a faculty-driven innovation cycle rather than the institutionally driven cycle that we've seen with a lot of these online learning platforms. And this, I do think, points to maybe the underexploited role of academic librarians in being the technical and pedagogic resources for some of this faculty practice to spread. So that would be really interesting to investigate. I do want to get back to the outcomes question because I think it's really, really interesting and something that a lot of people care about. I'll make a plug for the webinar I'm doing with Vera Michaelchek and Bill Penuel on Monday, which is also looking at some of how we've researched learning outcomes that are really trying to be not about the accountability and the accreditation conversation, but about continuous improvement and feedback that is valuable to faculty. I think that's just incredibly important, and we'll be offering a survey tool that Richard helped us with too, that faculty can use just to get meaningful feedback about their course, which is something that I think we all want, even though I think there's a lot of nervousness among faculty when those metrics are used for other purposes. And I think that's similar with some of what's happening in the learning analytics space. Is it's not that faculty don't want feedback on how they're doing in their courses, but the institutional uses of those data can be potentially scary and problematic. And I was curious to hear from either or both of you. In your book, you really make a very strong point, I think, that the metrics for learning outcomes are incredibly sparse. Colleges are measured around, sort of admissions numbers, graduation rates, and salary outcomes, which are, very kind of odd proxies for learning outcomes. I think that's a very important point you make in your book. And I guess my question is, what do you see as some sort of practical, positive directions in changing that conversation and bringing outcomes that are meaningful, measurement and outcomes that are meaningful and humane and productive in improving practice into the mix in a more effective way?
Well, there's a way to think about it on an institutional level and a broader kind of national level. On an institutional level, there are a number of schools that are trying new and innovative strategies and ways of engaging this. That are, for example, experimenting with e-portfolios, that are experimenting with capstones, that are developing an evaluation kind of system in which all faculty participate. So the faculty develop the evaluation system and they all contribute to it based on the goals they all agreed on. And students are tracked across years to see how much they develop. And so, I think there are, as Richard mentioned earlier, there's really eagerness among faculty to make sure students are learning and making progress. That's, we're in a classroom because, we hope that students are learning what we're trying to teach and they're improving in their skills and they're going to have great lives afterwards. And so there are a number of places where faculty are coming together and trying to figure out, whether within the major or whether it's more broadly at some of the liberal arts schools, it's actually the whole schools that are getting organized to think about, what are the goals, what are the outcomes, then how could we assess those, and how do we change our curriculum to get there? So I think there are lots of productive examples out there. I think the more difficult challenge is kind of how to catalyze those and make them kind of broader and reach the national scene. But I think the idea, faculty are interested in these endeavors and they are getting engaged in those endeavors, and they understand that if they don't get engaged in those endeavors, they're going to have bad metrics like first-year wage rate as a measure of their success, which is completely inappropriate, doesn't track with much of what happens in college or the quality of what happens in college. And so I think faculty are really on board with this. I think the question is how to set up institutional incentives and to facilitate their endeavors in this area.
Yeah, let me just jump in a little bit here on the last point you just made about the income measure. And so increasingly we see colleges and universities being held accountable for early earnings of their graduates. And what we make a very strong point in the book, and actually empirically demonstrate to a certain extent is that earnings really is not an appropriate measure for how graduates are faring, even in the labor market 2 years out. And instead, if you want to look at labor market outcomes, you have to look at other things like, are they in have they found jobs, occupations that are meaningful and on a path that you would hope they would aspire. And so we kind of that economics framework where you're looking at income to something that sociologists have been doing for several decades, and that is looking at the characteristics of the occupation. And again, when if you're going to look at labor market outcomes, at least look at labor market outcomes in a sensible way around the characteristics of occupations, whether or not someone is able to avoid unemployment and the like, not earnings which jump around a lot and really don't capture whether someone is, for example, taking a job as in the Peace Corps or interning, or is really on a path that you would like to see young people be on, but they're not making that much, and then it's held against them and their institution.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Maybe the Connected Courses community can be part of this sharing and scaling network for some of the positive innovations. I'm also reminded of efforts like the Colleges That Change Lives Consortium that are trying to change the conversation about what's the changing lives metric. How about that one? How would you measure that? Or the Gallup Purdue study that came out recently that's really looking at graduates a few years out and saying, well, we should look at life thriving as an outcome. And I think it's really interesting, your book is contributing to opening up this conversation about what we really want to be seeing, kids getting out of school. And do we really think that the salary that kids are earning a year out of college is what we should be measured on? So just a really important set of issues. I guess I'm trying to make sure I'm not missing some great questions on Twitter. I did want to, before we end, I did want to insert one of my pet issues, which is the relationship between higher education and what we're seeing happening in high school for college admissions. And I think one of the issues that I really want our higher education faculty and administrators to think about is the effect of our policies on the pain and suffering of college-going teens. I have a junior in my home right now, a high school junior, and the effect of admissions policies and certain kind of metrics on what we are doing to our kids in high school is something that I think all higher education institutions should be held accountable to. I also come from the context of being Japanese, and I didn't go through the Japanese educational system, but I certainly know about it. And the social contract for several generations there now has been that high school is when you work your butt off and you're preparing for college admissions and you don't have a life, and that is what you do. You get into college, so there's, like in the US, an arms race for college admissions. And then once you get in, you party for 4 years, and then you buckle down, get to work once you get a job. And I found it really interesting in your book, like when I was a kid going into the American system, the sense was that, yeah, you worked in high school, but it was really college where the academically rigorous stuff got into high gear, where it seems like the social contract is getting more and more like Japan, where high school is when the high-achieving kids are really just burning out, and then they party for 4 years in college. And I'm just wondering, I totally agree with your assessment of the system, but I don't feel there's something about the ecosystem of youth experience over those years that I feel like the social contract is changing, and that young people see their goals as very instrumentally defined as climbing this ladder and getting into college, and the bar for getting in is so high, and they're told that that's the goal of childhood, is to get into a good school. And then once you get in, no wonder they're adrift. So that's my little normative rant about that trajectory. as an observer of youth culture, but also a parent. And I'm curious whether you think some of that sort of life stage change is part of what you're seeing in terms of young people's lack of engagement in academics in college.
So yeah, so in the book we do note that we have these kind of countervailing trends where in high school over recent decades, increasing hours, students report increasing hours of studying. In college, decreasing hours of studying. And so we find that very interesting in part because it moves us away from saying there's something about something cultural about this generation, about this cohort. Because if they're studying more in high school but not in college, obviously what's happening is an interaction between the youth and the institutions that they're encountering. And so I'm not an expert. I've heard Mimi similar things about the Japanese system as what you've noted, although I haven't done systematic comparisons, so I wouldn't speak to it. But I do think that there are lessons maybe on both sides. And so in K-12 education, moving away from, I'm going to say this a different way. It's easy to give a criticism of the increased testing in K-12 education, and for many people, including perhaps your children and my own, that are in middle-class communities that are college-bound, there's negative effects that you can point to. But as a whole, let's remember the heterogeneity in U.S. society, and that for many students, that those policies were designed to lift up the bottom and make sure that all students were confronted with a more rigorous and challenging academic curriculum. And so I'm reluctant to kind of to join the chorus of criticism around this, but I do think that what's now being contemplated to move those assessments, and maybe there's been too much testing in K-12, but to move the testing that does exist to make it closer aligned to 21st century needs, and that is to move away from multiple choice testing to performance-based tasks that at least try to measure and assess students' competencies more broadly. And that's part of what the assessment redesign work has been that community's been busy struggling with in the last couple of years. I think that's a good one. And then when in college, it's not enough that the students are exhausted and have been put through the ringer to go to the most selective colleges and universities. They need to be, they need to be confronted with a counter narrative about what this college and university life is all about, and what they can accomplish in the 4 years that they're investing there. And those years are, they're too precious to waste in not taking advantage of the academic riches and resources available in higher education institutions, and increasingly the resources that are available online and in open access resources that are going to be made available.
Yeah, and just to be clear, I'm not advocating for the Japanese system. I'm just concerned that the U.S. is moving in that direction. Definitely.
I've heard multiple commentators on our work make that very point.
Yeah. Yes, but did you want to jump in there?
Yeah, and as I said, anecdotally, what you're saying certainly resonates. I mean, there are lots of reports of students at very selective schools saying, college is a 4-year vacation. I mean, literally in the sense of I've really worked hard, I've really done all this in high school, SATs and APs and extracurriculars and everything I possibly could to get into the school I wanted to. And once I once I get a job, I presume I'm going to have to work again. And so this is, it's a 4-year vacation. The problem, of course, is that it's a very expensive 4-year vacation, and that most people can't afford a 4-year vacation, and we as a country can't afford a 4-year vacation. And so if that's the direction we're moving in, it's certainly not the direction we want to be in.
Yeah.
Let me jump in. With one additional comment on this strand. We haven't talked about directly yet in this conversation is the civic engagement measures, and we have very crude measures in our study, but ones that again point very clearly to a problem in that area. And so we asked graduates 2 years after finishing college, how often do you read the newspaper in print or online? And 36% said monthly or never. And it's similar results when we ask them, how often do you discuss politics or public affairs with friends, family, or coworkers? And the graduates 2 years out of college said 39% say monthly or never. We don't talk about politics and public affairs. And that really, we can't afford a 4-year student spending 4 years in these institutions and not understanding that they have a responsibility in a democratic society to engage in these basic forms of citizenship, keeping up with the news, talking about politics and public affairs on a regular basis with those in their community. And again, it's one thing if they're not if students aren't developing critical thinking, complex reasoning, and writing skills in college, and instead just enjoying the social amenities there. But it's quite another if they're not developing a sense and attitudes and dispositions around kind of, again, exercising these basic functions of democratic citizenship.
Yeah, no, I think that's such an important point. I want to come back to that, but there's one question on the Twitter chat from Andrea saying, what about students who aren't aiming for the most elite institutions? How are these dynamics playing out? And definitely what I was describing is, for families with relatively high educational attainment, assume they're college-bound students. Are these dynamics around admissions and so on playing out differently for kids who, maybe first-generation college-going and so on?
Most students in this country attend schools that are essentially open admission or close to open admission. So I think we pay a lot of attention to how do you get into the top 10%, but most students don't go to those kinds of schools. And so I think the high school, they're not spending their high school doing all the activities in order to get ready. But in this country and in most societies, what happens at the top trickles down. And so kind of what happens in high schools and what are expectations of high schools and what it means to succeed is getting redefined in ways that is is driven by what it means to be able to access these institutions. And once students get into college, right, we find very little studying across the board, right? And so maybe the more advantaged students are taking a vacation, and maybe there's a different set of mechanisms happening for students who are at open access or less, selective schools. But the problems that we observe in higher education in the sense of, low levels of rigor, low academic demands, few hours spent studying, that's across the board. We find it at all schools across the board.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So I know we're getting near the top of the hour, but I wish we could keep talking, so I just want to insert one last question. I think the point that Richard was raising about engagement in civic and political life is incredibly important, and I want to tie it to this question about the changing value structures and whether, these instrumentally driven kind of learning goals that we're instilling in our kids throughout their education, the trickle-down effect, but just the, general malaise that we're seeing about, what I see as, a conflict between progressive, meaningful, purpose-driven kinds of educational goals and ones that are sort of instrumental and stepwise, and maybe in a period of time when kids could graduate with a degree and had a ladder of, career that they could just step into, that kind of more instrumental sort of pathway cultivation could have been a value structure that was effective. But it seems like that social contract is breaking down in pretty fundamental ways, and we're preparing our kids and telling them that there's sort of this ladder of get this score, put together this portfolio of classes, and so on, and that's not necessarily what's going to make them thrive in life. And I think that's the broader change in the ecosystem that our institutions of higher education, both in terms of the admissions criteria, right? That's where it starts, because that's who you're getting, the expectations you've set up, and then what's happening on campus is in many ways a reflection of the values that are reflected in admissions criteria. So I just feel like that's such a critical, it's setting, that's where there are a really concrete set of metrics that are being conveyed to young people. And then after that, they go into the workplace and it's sort of, what do I do? And that dynamic is really, really troubling for me. I did want to just point to what I think is another important finding related to this in the civic piece in your book, which is that when you talk to kids who are adrift after college, they're actually pretty happy. So I thought there was an interesting moment in your book where you said, well, do we really have a problem here? Because they think they're great, and they're doing better than their parents. And there seems like a positive thing here where they say, well, it's not just about the money. There is a bit of a reaction to the greed-centered values that they probably think defined an earlier generation. So there's a positive value set that's embedded in their optimism. But then there's this negative side, which is that, oh, well, maybe they're not greedy, but they're also not giving back much. They're not engaged in civic life in their community. So I'm just curious about your read on that. In closing, if you could kind of give us your gut on where you think kids are these days and how worried should we be about them?
Yeah, so let me say something about that and also come back to the instrumental question about the instrumental value of college and how that's inadequate. So yeah, one of the striking findings Joseph and I find in the work is that 95% of the graduates, when surveyed 2 years out, say their life will be the same or better than their parents. 95%, 3/4 are getting financial assistance from their parents, 1/4 are living back at their parents, and it didn't matter whether they were unemployed or employed. Again, wildly optimistic about their futures, and we think there's complex reasons for that. I'm not sure it's a turn away from I'm not sure your interpretation that it's a turn away from the consumer and consumer values in our society and the greed in society. It could be the case. I'm not sure. I think part of it is probably they went through college, and again 36% studied alone less than an hour a day, and they had, when we looked at their transcripts, they had B+ averages. And so they were told in college, you can find success at very little effort. And so we think that's partly responsible for shaping their optimism and their lack of sense of what success requires as adults, not just in the labor market, but in all aspects of society. The other point you were making about kind of that the instrumental value of college is not sufficient, I think is a really important one. If college is only about securing a good job after it, that's not sufficient to get students to apply themselves broadly to their academics in college. It also turns out that it's not sufficient as a rationale when you go to state governments and ask for public expenditures on higher education. It's important, but if you look at the record over the last couple of decades, it hasn't been sufficient. And so I think it's interesting to have an historical perspective on that and remember that colleges and universities in this country were originally formed often by religious orders for larger moral purposes and functions. That declined in the 20s and 30s, but quickly replacing that after World War II was the Cold War as a rationale for U.S. higher education. That we needed a higher education system produce great scientists and compete broadly and create democratic citizens in this global confrontation that we were facing. Now, with the absence of the Cold War, what is the purpose of higher education? And again, if it's just around these instrumental value of preparing people for the economy, I think that's not a sufficient rationale for motivating students, nor is it a sufficient recapture the necessary resources to expand higher education to meet the needs of more and more students in the future.
Josipa, do you want to have the last word here?
No, that's okay. Other than to follow up on Richard and say we need a new vision for higher education. We need to articulate, what are we here for? What are we doing? What can we accomplish? And the conversation has been very impoverished, very driven with income and earnings and early labor market outcome. And some of it has to do with consumerism and historical moments and all kinds of changes, but some of it has to do with a lack of higher education providing an alternative vision and really putting it out there in terms of what we are doing, what can we accomplish, and how are we going to do that. And I think we need visionary leadership.
I think that's a fantastic note to end on. Thank you both for a super engaging and enlightening conversation, and also for your research that's really enabled us to start asking these really fundamental and important questions. So again, thank you for all of you who joined on the Twitter chat and as well, and I hope you'll stay engaged in this conversation as this course moves forward.
And thank you, Mimi, for the community you've built and letting us share with them today.
Great to have you both.
Thank you.